Joe Rogan literally at the epicenter of the culture war.
Who would have ever thunk?
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and this is Winnie the Westie, who's getting ready for his afternoon nap, even if he doesn't want to take one. If you had said 20 years ago that Joe Rogan on news radio would one day literally be the epicenter of the culture war, nobody would have believed you. If you had suggested this 15 plus years ago when Joe Rogan was hosting The Fear Factor, people would have called you crazy. If you had suggested this 10 years ago when Joe Rogan was doing the announcement for the UFC or doing stand-up comedy, people would have never believed you. But lo and behold, Joe Rogan is literally the hero at the epicenter of the culture wars in real time. Critics like to write Joe Rogan off as a lowly stand-up comic, as though people don't truly appreciate that in order to be a good, funny, successful stand-up comic, you have to have a reasonably well-working brain in order to come to assessments and insights that people are going to find funny. George Carlin, Mitch Hedberg, Stephen Wright, you cannot be a successful stand-up comic if you are not intelligent, and Joe Rogan, for all his foibles, whatever they may be, is exquisitely intelligent. And he has used that intelligence, that charisma, that willingness to dive deep into things, to have meaningful, open, and above all else, uncensored discussions with everybody and everybody to become probably the most important player in the culture wars. He has more of a following, pretty much, than all of MSM combined, and a lot of people don't really like that. When you fight corruption, it fights back. Nuhu Rabadu. I have loved this saying ever since I first discovered it, but the funny thing here is that it's not exactly like Joe Rogan is going out there to fight corruption. He is just trying to have open discourse, open dialogue to enlighten the masses, but it would seem that in the era of insanity, enlightening the masses is an attack on corruption, and that corruption definitely fights back, and they are fighting back at Joe Rogan right now. From the Rolling Stone, quote, "a menace to public health," end quote. Doctors demand Spotify puts an end to COVID lies on, quote, Joe Rogan experience, end quote. As an infectious disease epidemiologist and research fellow at Boston's Children's Hospital who debunks health misinformation on Instagram, where she has more than 380,000 followers, Jessica Malati Rivera regularly receives tips from her followers about viral content to debunk. A few weeks ago, her followers started sending her a link to an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, the most popular podcast in the world. The episode was an interview with Dr. Robert Malone, a virologist who touts himself as one of the architects of mRNA technology. For those of you who don't know, Joe Rogan has the largest podcast in the world, and he recently hosted an episode with Dr. Robert Malone, and if you haven't seen that episode or listened to that episode, you should go watch and listen to that episode. I'm not going to get into it because I'm not a doctor, and I don't want to get accused of spreading medical misinformation. Listen to the episode, listen to it for yourselves. Malone talks about a lot of things, mass formation psychosis, which fact checkers had to go out and debunk as a fake fact, whatever they do. Just the funny thing here as to how the Rolling Stone describes Dr. Robert Malone, they say he touts himself as one of the architects of mRNA technology as though it's somehow in dispute. He is, by all accounts, apparently one of the architects, one of the original founders of mRNA technology. But if you thought that was bad, just wait until we read the next paragraph as to how the Rolling Stone frames Dr. Robert Malone. Rivera was familiar with Rogan as well as Malone. She knew that Malone had been banned from Twitter for promoting COVID-19 misinformation, and that he had been making the rounds in conservative media circles, undermining the efficacy of the vaccine. When she watched the interview, she was horrified to see that he espoused various conspiratorial and baseless beliefs, from the idea that, quote, mass formation psychosis, end quote, is responsible for people believing in the efficacy of vaccines, to the claim popular among anti-vaxxers that hospitals are financially incentivized to falsely diagnose COVID-19 deaths. The episode featuring Malone went viral and was shared widely in right-wing media circles as well as on Facebook, where the link on Spotify has been shared nearly 25,000 times, according to CrowdTangle data. We are going to get more into the idea that the people screaming misinformation are the ones who are themselves promoting the most misinformation, but my goodness, the misinformation in this one paragraph alone
is mind-boggling.
First and foremost, unless I misunderstood something, when Dr. Robert Malone was talking about mass formation psychosis, it was not in the context of how people came to believe that the vaccines were effective. It was in the context of describing how society descended into 1930s Germany madness. It was in the context of explaining how people could justify atrocities to themselves. It was in the context of people believing absurdities, not as relates to the vaccine, but as relates to the type of treatment other people should endure for their beliefs. But maybe I misunderstood it.
Basically, European intellectual inquiry into what the heck happened in Germany in the 20s and 30s. Very intelligent, highly educated population, and they went barking mad. The answer is mass formation psychosis. When you have a society that has become decoupled from each other and has free-floating anxiety and a sense that things don't make sense, we can't understand it, and then their attention gets focused by a leader or a series of events on one small point, just like hypnosis, literally become hypnotized and can be led anywhere. That is how mass formation psychosis happens. And that is what's happened here.
But I don't think I am. I think that the Rolling Stones, the people who are crying foul that Dr. Robert Malone is providing misinformation, are themselves deliberately providing misinformation about Dr. Robert Malone. And Rolling Stones likes to cite the fact that Dr. Robert Malone was banned from Twitter as though that somehow discredits him on a going forward basis. Let's just go to PolitiFact to see why exactly Dr. Robert Malone was banned from Twitter. Though a spokesman for Twitter did not say which of Malone's tweets were in violation of the platform's policies, archives of Malone's page show it was littered with vaccine skepticism. In June, he tweeted that a study showed that for every 3 lives the vaccine saved, they caused 2 deaths. But the journal that published the study later appended a note to it, calling its main conclusion incorrect, and then retracted it entirely. So Dr. Malone tweeted a study that was actually published by a journal who then later revised their study and then retracted it altogether, and somehow Dr. Robert Malone himself is the one guilty of providing misinformation on Twitter, although Twitter does not mention which tweets in particular allegedly violated their terms of service. Dr. Robert Malone is undermining the vaccine.
He is fully vaccinated.
So you're kind of asking my origin story with COVID.
Yes. I mean, were you initially, have you taken the COVID vaccine?
So the answer is yes. I've also been infected twice.
And then, in order to support their own claim that Dr. Robert Malone has provided misinformation, what better authority than themselves? The same month, PolitiFact rated false a video featuring Malone that claimed the spike proteins generated after vaccination are toxic to cells. Other fact-checkers debunked his related claim in another video that the spike proteins often cause irreparable damage to children's vital organs. Later on in the article, Rivera expresses her dismay at how people she thought intelligent allegedly fell for this misinformation, and she explains what she wants to do with this alleged misinformation: shut it down. Yet Rivera was even more horrified to discover that people in her life, whom she considered to be, quote, quite wise and discerning, end quote, were hoodwinked by Malone's patina of academic credibility, considering his views on the vaccine legitimate. Quote, when I saw they were falling victim to this, I spoke to some colleagues and we said something has to be done at this point, end quote, she says.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Yup, that is the perfectly mature, rational, and above all else, democratic thing to do when faced with information you do not like or disagree with. Shut it down. Viva Frei at the Viva Frei. My immediate reaction when faced with any alleged misinformation is to immediately block my ears and get the authorities to make that person stop talking. Every single time. And in case anyone had any lingering doubts, because sometimes sarcasm translates badly on Twitter, yes, that was intended to be sarcasm, and anyone out there who thought I was being serious,
I have some questions for you.
So the news of the day is that 270 doctors, count them people, 270 doctors signed an open letter to Spotify to shut down Joe Rogan's misinformation. The mainstream media ran with it, and the only problem, that itself is misinformation. Rolling Stone, quote, a menace to public health, end quote, doctors demand Spotify puts an end to COVID lies on, quote, Joe Rogan experience, end quote. The Guardian, quote, menace to public health, end quote, 270 doctors criticize Spotify over Joe Rogan's podcast. Yahoo Life, 270 doctors called Joe Rogan's podcast a, quote, menace to public health, end quote. And because fake news does what fake news does, they create their fake news vortex. Here you have Yahoo News actually citing that article from The Guardian. Quote, The Guardian, end quote, reports an open letter signed by 270 doctors and healthcare professionals has expressed concerns that misinformation is becoming a theme on, quote, the Joe Rogan podcast, end quote. The letter reportedly says that Spotify, the streaming company that has listed Rogan's podcast as its most popular. That seems to be a fragmented sentence there, but as anybody who follows me on Twitter knows, I am the last person on earth who can pick on someone else's typo. And last but not least, Fox News. 270 medical experts write open letter to Spotify calling out Joe Rogan's, quote, harmful, end quote, COVID-19 misinformation. The only problem and the cosmically karmic irony of that headline accusing Joe Rogan of spreading misinformation, that headline itself is misinformation. Wait until you see who the 270 signatories to that letter are. This article comes from journalist Jordan Schachtel's Substack, and if the name sounds familiar, he was on a sidebar not long ago. It was a great episode. If you haven't seen it, go back and give it a watch. But this is from his Substack, and this is what he discovered when looking into that letter with a little bit of detail, a little more detail than mainstream media bothers to offer. Quote, 270 doctors, end quote, called out Joe Rogan, but the authors of the letter and the vast majority of its signatories are not medical doctors. Only a handful are practicing physicians.
What? No. No. What? No.
Are you seeing all of those blaring corporate press headlines targeting Joe Rogan this weekend, reporting on a letter from, quote, 270 doctors, end quote, which described the famous podcaster as a, quote, menace to public health? Well, it turns out that the real arbiters of misinformation are the individuals behind the letter itself, and they are being helped along by a corrupt corporate media that is misreporting the credentials of its signatories. The people accusing others of spreading misinformation are themselves spreading misinformation, and this goes back to a quote which has been attributed to Joseph Goebbels: accuse your enemies of doing what you are doing so as to create confusion. The people accusing Joe Rogan of spreading misinformation are themselves guilty of spreading misinformation. My goodness, when you fight corruption, corruption fights back. From Schachtel's article, well, I reviewed this open letter, and it turns out that only around 100 of the 270 plus signatories to the letter are people with qualified medical degrees. And a large chunk of that 100 or so medical doctors are MDs employed at universities who are not in fact practitioners of medicine. Yet the letter reads, quote, as physicians, we bear the arduous weight of a pandemic that has stretched our medical systems to their limits and only stands to be exacerbated by the anti-vaccination sentiment woven into this and other episodes of Rogan's podcast, end quote. It's very interesting signing a letter that says, as physicians, if you're not in fact a physician. Some might call that fraudulent misrepresentation of credentials. And it's even more interesting that you would have all of the mainstream media in unison repeating and citing this letter without itself doing the slightest bit of verification to make sure the people who actually signed that letter as physicians are in fact physicians. And this highlights one of the other absurdities, paradoxes of this entire pandemic. If you are a doctor who agrees with the narrative, it doesn't matter what kind of doctor you are. You could be a skin doctor, and if you agree with the narrative, you are to be hailed as a hero. However, if you dare say anything that questions the official narrative, my goodness, will your credentials be analyzed? And if you are a lowly skin doctor, then you have no business talking about this because you're not an epidemiologist. And if you are an epidemiologist or an individual who, say, had a hand in developing the mRNA technology itself, if you dare say anything that goes against the narrative, you're a quack and you need to be erased from social media. And if you are the biggest podcaster on earth who dares have an open discussion with these individuals so the public can scrutinize their claims, my goodness, you need to be shut down as well. And then remember that Jessica Rivera who said something has to be done to stop this menace to society, Joe Rogan? Wait until you hear her credentials, because this is just the absolute kick in the teeth. Paradoxically, the disseminators of this petition are guilty of the very misinformation label that they've attached to Rogan. In fact, neither of the two reported co-authors of the letter, Jessica Rivera or Ben Ryan, possess medical degrees. Rivera holds a master's degree and Ryan is a PhD academic who researches psychiatry. Yep, someone with a master's degree surely has the requisite credentials to accuse one of the founders of mRNA technology of spreading misinformation, so long as she makes the accusation following the narrative. The letter denouncing Joe Rogan and pressuring Spotify to censor his speech has all kinds of random signatories. By my count, the letter is signed by over 50 PhD academics, around 60 college professors, 29 nurses, 10 students, 4 medical residents, and even a handful of science podcasters. The letter, which uses the word misinformation 9 times in 5 paragraphs, concludes with a call for Spotify to censor Rogan as part of a policy to, quote, moderate misinformation on the platform, end quote. And if these are the moderators who want to moderate, I've got one question: who is going to moderate the moderators? And the funny thing is, I think the MSM is objectively guilty of spreading misinformation. I think that people having signed this letter are guilty of arguably overplaying their qualifications, but I'm not calling to censor them. I think public discussion is the way to resolve this, because have a public discussion and let the world know that those 270 doctors that the mainstream media was running with in their headlines are in fact not 270 doctors, and anybody having said that is guilty of having spread misinformation. In fact, if the reporting by Jordan Schachtel is even remotely accurate, it would seem that the majority of the signatories to that letter are in fact less qualified than the people they are accusing of having spread misinformation. But at the end of the day, this is a battle for information, which means that this is a battle for free speech, which means that any of the warriors for free speech are going to be a prime target, and Joe Rogan, you are the biggest warrior for free speech right now on the market. So when it comes to all the people out there who want to deplatform, censor people on the basis that they are spreading misinformation, I say we shine that big, shiny light on them to reveal that they are in fact the ones spreading misinformation because they want to control the dialogue, because they want to control people's access to information. And that is the purpose of this vlog. And with that said, if you like my videos, you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm. If you want to support the channel, all of these support links are in the pinned comment. We've got some great merch. Robert Barnes and I do weekly streams every Sunday. We do weekly streams with a guest every Wednesday called The Sidebar. If you want to find us and support us on Locals, or support us get tons of exclusive content, you can find us at
VivaBarnesLaw.locals.com.
All of my content is also on Rumble, which has recently merged with Locals, and you can find a neat little widget on my Rumble page, which will bring you directly to our Locals community if you are so inclined. But more important than anything, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah! Bye.